In the oblique evening shadow cast by a heap of baggage piled on the platform, Vronsky, in his long paletot and slouch hat, with his hands in his pockets, was walking, like a wild beast in a cage, up and down a narrow space where he could not take more than a score of steps. It seemed to Sergey Ivanovitch as he drew near that Vronsky saw him but pretended not to recognize him. But to Sergey Ivanovitch this was all the same. He was above any petty susceptibility. At this moment, Vronsky, in his eyes, was an important actor in a grand event, and deserved to be sustained and encouraged. He approached the count. Vronsky stopped, looked at him, recognized him, and taking a few steps to meet him, cordially held out his hand. "Perhaps you would prefer not to see me," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "But can I be of any service to you?" "No one could be less unpleasant for me to meet than you," answered Vronsky. "Pardon me. There is nothing pleasant for me in life." "I understand, and I want to offer you my services," said Kozneushchev, struck by the deep suffering that was apparent in the count's face. "Might not a letter to Restich or Milan be of some use to you?" "Oh, no," answered Vronsky, making an effort to understand. "If it is all the same to you, we will walk a little. It is so stifling in the train. A letter? No, thank you. One needs no letter of introduction to get killed. In this case, one to the Turks, perhaps," added he, with a smile at the corners of his mouth. His eyes kept the same expression of bitter sadness. "Well, it would make it easier for you to come into relations with men prepared for action. Still, as you please. But I was very glad to learn of your decision. The very fact that a man of your standing has joined the volunteers will raise them above all cavil in the public estimation." "My sole merit," replied Vronsky, "is that life is of no value to me. As to physical energy, I know it will not be wanting for any purpose. And I am glad enough to give my life, which is not only useless to me, but disgusting, to be useful to somebody." And he made an impatient motion with his jaw, caused by his unceasing toothache, which prevented him from talking with the expression he desired. "You will be regenerated, it is my prediction," said Sergey Ivanovitch, feeling touched. "The deliverance of one's oppressed brethren is an aim for which one might well live as die. May God grant you full success, and fill your soul with peace," he added, and held out his hand. Vronsky pressed his hand cordially. "As a field piece I may be of use. But as a man, I am only a ruin," murmured the count, with intervals between the phrases. The throbbing pain in his tooth, which filled his mouth with saliva, made it an effort for him to speak. He stopped and fixed his eyes mechanically on the engine wheels, which advanced, revolving slowly and smoothly on the rails. And suddenly a sense of intense spiritual anguish caused him for a moment to forget his toothache. At the sight of the engine and the rails, through the influence of his talk with an acquaintance with whom he had not seen since his misfortune, she suddenly appeared to him, or, at least, that which remained of her, as, when he rushed like a madman into the barracks near the station where they had carried her, he saw, lying on a table, shamelessly exposed to the sight of all, her bleeding body, which had so lately been full of life. Her head was uninjured, with its heavy braids and its light curls clustering around the temples, was leaning back with the eyes half closed, and in the lovely face hovered still a strange, wild expression, while her rosy lips, slightly opened, seemed prepared to utter once again that terrible menace, to predict to him, as she had in their dispute, that he would repent. And he tried to remember how she looked when he first met her, also at a railroad station, with that mysterious, poetic, charming beauty, overflowing with life and gaiety, demanding and bestowing happiness, and not bitterly revengeful as he remembered her at their last interview. He tried to remember the happy moments he had spent with her, but these moments were forever spoiled for him. He remembered only her face, haughtily expressing her threat of unnecessary, but implacable, vengeance. He ceased to be conscious of his toothache, and sobs convulsed his face. After walking up and down by the baggage once or twice, the count controlled himself and spoke calmly with Sergey Ivanovitch. "Have you seen the latest telegrams?" Yes, they have fought 3 times, and another battle is expected tomorrow." And after a few words about King Milan's proclamation, and the immense effect which it might have, the 2 men separated at the ringing of the second bell, and went to their respective compartments. As Sergey Ivanovitch had not known just when it would be possible for him to leave Moscow, he did not telegraph his brother to send for him. Levin was not at home when he and Katavasov, black as negroes with smoke and dust, reached Pokrovskoye about noon in a tarantass which they had hired at the station. Kitty was sitting on the balcony with her father and sister when she saw her brother-in-law approaching, and she ran to meet him. "Your conscience ought to prick you for not letting us know," said she, shaking hands with Sergey Ivanovitch and offering her brow to be kissed. "We got on splendidly, and we did not have to bother you. I am so dusty that I fear to touch you. I was so busy that I did not know when I could leave. And you look the same as ever," said he, smiling, "enjoying the gentle current of your softly flowing happiness. And here is our friend, Fyodor Vasilyevitch, who has come at last." "But I am not a negro. When I have washed I shall look like a human being," said Katavasov, with his usual pleasantry, offering his hand and laughing, so that his white teeth gleamed out from his dusty face. "Kostya will be very glad. He is out on the farm, but he ought to be back by this time." "Always occupied with his estate," said Katavasov. "The rest of us can think of nothing but the Serbian war. How does my friend regard this subject? He is sure not to think as other people do." "Yes, he does, but perhaps not like everybody," said Kitty, a little confused, looking at Sergey Ivanovitch. "I will send some one to find him. We have papa with us just now. He has recently come back from abroad." And Kitty, while making her arrangements to send for Levin, and to furnish her guests a chance to wash off the dust, the one in the library, the other in the room assigned to Dolly, and then to have luncheon ready for them, enjoyed the full power of quick motion, which before her baby was born she had been so long deprived of. Then she went to the balcony where her father was. "It's Sergey Ivanovitch and Professor Katavasov." "Ugh! In this heat! It will be a bore." "Not at all, papa. He is very nice, and Kostya loves him dearly," said Kitty, laughing at the expression of consternation on her father's face. "Go entertain them, Tushenka," she said to her sister. "They saw Stiva at the station. He was well, and I am going to the baby for a little while. I actually have not nursed him since morning. He will be crying if I don't go." And she, feeling the pressure of milk, hastened to the nursery. In reality it had not been guesswork with her. The tie that bound her to the child was still unbroken. She actually knew by the flow of milk that he needed something to eat. Even before she reached the nursery she knew that he would be crying, and indeed he was. She heard his voice and quickened her steps. But the more she hurried, the louder he cried. It was a fine, healthy scream, a scream of hunger and impatience. "Am I late, nurse? Late?" asked Kitty, sitting down and getting ready to suckle the child. "There, give him to me. Give him to me, quick. Ugh, nurse, how stupid! Take off his cap afterward," said she, quite as impatient as her baby. The baby screamed as if it were famished. Now, it can't be helped, little mother," said Agafya Mikhailovna, who could not keep out of the nursery. "You must do things in order." "Agu, agu," she chuckled to the infant, not heeding Kitty's impatience. The nurse gave the child to his mother. Agafya Mikhailovna followed the child, her face all aglow with tenderness. "He knows me! He knows me! God is my witness, he knew me, Matushka Katerina Alexandrovna!" she cried. But Kitty did not hear what she said. Her impatience was as great as the baby's. It hindered the very thing that they both desired. The baby, in his haste to suckle, could not manage to take hold, and was vexed. At last, after one final shriek of despair, the arrangements were perfected, and mother and child, simultaneously breathing a sigh of content, became calm. "The poor little thing is all in a perspiration," whispered Kitty. "Do you really think he knew you?" she added, looking down into the child's eyes, which seemed to her to peep out roguishly from under his cap, as his little cheeks sucked in and out, while his little hand, with rosy palm, flourished around his head. "It cannot be, for, if he knew you, He would surely know me," continued Kitty, with a smile, when Agafya Mikhailovna persisted in her belief that he knew her. She smiled because she said that he could not recognize her, yet she knew in her heart that he not only recognized Agafya Mikhailovna, but that he knew and understood all things, and knew and understood what no one else understood, and things which she, his mother, was now beginning to understand only through his teaching. For Agafya Mikhailovna, for the nurse, for his grandfather, even for his father, Mitya was just a little human being, who needed nothing but physical care. For his mother, he was a being endowed with moral faculties, who already had a whole history of spiritual relationships. "You will see if he doesn't when he wakes up. When I do this way, his face will light up, the little dove. It will light up like a bright day," said Agafya Mikhailovna. "There, very well, very well, we shall see," whispered Kitty. "Now go away, he is going to sleep." Agafya Mikhailovna went away on tiptoe. The nurse closed the blinds, chased away the flies which were hidden under the muslin curtain of the cradle. Then she sat down and began to wave a little withered branch over the mother and child. "It is hot, hot. Pray God, he may send me a little shower," she said. "Da, da, shh," was the mother's reply, as she rocked gently to and fro, and pressed Mitya to her breast. His eyelids now opened and now closed, and he languidly moved his chubby arm. This little arm disturbed Kitty. She felt a strong inclination to kiss it, but she feared to do so lest she should wake him. At last the arm began to droop, and the eyes closed more and more. Only rarely now would he raise his long lashes and gaze at his mother with his dark, dewy eyes. The nurse began to nod, and dropped off into a nap. Overhead she could hear the old prince's voice and Katavasov's sonorous laugh. "Evidently they don't need me to help in the conversation," thought Kitty. "But it's too bad that Kostya is not there. He must have gone to his bees. Sometimes it disturbs me to have him spend so much time over them. But then, on the whole, I am glad. It diverts him, and he is certainly more cheerful than he was in the spring. Then he was so gloomy and so unhappy. What a strange man he is!" Kitty knew what caused her husband's disquiet. It was his doubting spirit, and although, if she had been asked if she believed that, in the world to come, he would fail of salvation owing to his want of faith, she would have been compelled to say yes, yet his skepticism did not make her unhappy, and she, who believed that there was no salvation for the unbelieving, and loved more than all else in the world her husband's soul, smiled as she thought of his skepticism, and called him a strange man. Why does he spend all his time reading those philosophical books? If all this is written in those books, then he can understand them. But if it is not true, why does he read them? He himself says that he longs for faith. Why doesn't he believe? Probably he thinks too much, and he thinks too much because he is lonely. He is always alone. He can't speak out all his thoughts to us. I think he will be glad that these guests have come, especially Katavasov. He likes to discuss with him. And immediately Kitty's thoughts were diverted by the question where it would be best for Katavasov to sleep. Ought he and Sergey Ivanovitch to have a room together or apart? And here a sudden thought made her start, so that she disturbed Mitya, who opened his eyes and looked at her reproachfully. "The washerwoman hasn't brought back the linen. I hope Agafya Mikhailovna hasn't given out all we had," and the color rushed to Kitty's forehead. "There, I must find out myself," thought she, and reverting to her former thoughts, she remembered that she had not finished the important train of spiritual thoughts which she had begun, and she once more repeated, "Yes, Kostya is an unbeliever," and, as she did so, she smiled. "Yes, he is an unbeliever. But I'd far liefer he should be one than a person like Madame Stahl, or as I wanted to be when I was abroad. At any rate, he will never be hypocritical." And a recent example of his goodness recurred vividly to her memory. Several weeks before, Stepan Arkadyevitch had written to Dolly a letter of repentance. He begged her to save his honor by selling her property to pay his debts. Dolly was in despair. She hated her husband, despised him, and at first she made up her mind to refuse his request, to apply for a divorce, but afterwards she decided to sell a part of her estate. Kitty, with an involuntary smile of emotion, recalled her husband's confusion, his various awkward attempts to find a way of helping Dolly, and how, at last, he came to the conclusion that the only way to accomplish it without wounding her was to make over to Dolly their part of this estate. "How can he be without faith, when he has such a warm heart, and is afraid to grieve even a child? He never thinks of himself, always of others. Sergey Ivanovitch finds it perfectly natural to consider him his business manager. So does his sister. Dolly and her children have no one else but him to lean upon. He is always sacrificing his time to the peasants, who come to consult him every day. Yes, you cannot do better than to try to be like your father," she murmured, touching her lips to her son's cheek, before laying him in the nurse's arms. Ever since that moment when, as he sat beside his dying brother, Levin had examined the problem of life and death in the light of the new convictions, as he called them, which from the age of 20 to 34 years had taken the place of his childhood beliefs, he was terrified not only at death, but at life, because it seemed to him that he had not the slightest knowledge of its origin, its purpose, its reason, its nature. Our organism and its destruction, the indestructibility of matter, the laws of the conservation and development of forces, were words which were substituted for the terms of his early faith. These words, and the scientific theories connected with them, were doubtless interesting from an intellectual point of view, but they stood for nothing in the face of real life. And Levin suddenly felt in the position of a man who, in cold weather, had exchanged his warm shuba for a muslin garment, and who for the first time should indubitably, not with his reason, but with his whole being, become persuaded that he was absolutely naked, and inevitably destined to perish miserably. From that time, without the least changing his outward life, and though he did not like to confess it, even to himself, Levin never ceased to feel a terror of his ignorance. Moreover, he vaguely felt that what he called his convictions not only came from his ignorance, but were idle for helping him to a clearer knowledge of what he needed. At first his marriage, with its new joys and its new duties, completely blotted out these thoughts, but they came back to him with increasing persistence, demanding an answer, after his wife's confinement, when he lived in Moscow without any serious occupation. The question presented itself to him in this way: "If I did not accept the explanations offered me by Christianity on the problem of my existence, then what answer shall I find?" And he scrutinized the whole arsenal of his scientific convictions, and found no answer whatever to his questions, and nothing like an answer. He was in the position of a man who seeks to find food in a toy store or a gun shop. Involuntarily and unconsciously he sought now in every book, in every conversation, and in every person whom he met some sympathy with these questions and their solution. More than anything else he was surprised and puzzled by the fact that the men of his class, who for the most part had, like himself, substituted science for religion, seemed to experience not the least moral suffering, but to live entirely satisfied and content. Thus, in addition to the main question, there were others which tormented him. Were these men sincere? Were they not hypocrites? Or did they understand more clearly than he did the answer science gave to these troublesome questions? Again he took to studying these men, and books which might contain the solutions which he so desired. One thing which he had discovered, however, since these questions had begun to occupy him, was that he had made a gross error in taking up with the ideas of his early university friends that religion had outlived its day and no longer existed. The best people whom he knew were believers: the old prince, Lvov, of whom he was so fond, Sergey Ivanovitch, and all women had faith, and his wife believed just as he had believed when he was a child, and 9/10 of the Russian people, all the people whose lives inspired the greatest respect, were believers. Another strange thing was that, as he read many books, he became convinced that the men whose opinions he shared did not attach to them any importance, and that without explaining anything, they simply ignored these questions, without an answer to which life seemed to him impossible, and took up others which were to him utterly uninteresting, such, for example, as the development of the organism, the mechanical explanation of the soul, and others. Moreover, at the time of his wife's illness, he had what to him seemed a most extraordinary experience. He, the unbeliever, had prayed, and prayed with sincere faith, but as soon as the danger was over, he felt that he could not give that temporary disposition any abiding place in his life. He could not avow that the truth appeared to him then, but that he was mistaken now, because, as he began calmly to analyze his feelings, they eluded him. He could not avow that he had been deceived then, because he had experienced a temporary spiritual condition, and if he pretended that he had succumbed to a moment of weakness, he would sully a sacred moment. He was in a state of internal conflict, and he strove with all the strength of his nature to free himself from it. These thoughts tormented him with varying intensity, but he could not free himself from them. He read and meditated, but the more he read and meditated, the end desired seemed to grow more and more remote. During the latter part of his stay in Moscow, and after he reached the country, he became convinced of the uselessness of seeking in materialism an answer to his doubts, and he read over the philosophers whose explanations of life were opposed to materialism, Plato and Spinoza, and Kant and Schelling, and Hegel and Schopenhauer. These thoughts seemed to him fruitful while he was reading, or was contrasting their doctrines with those of others, especially with those of a materialistic tendency. But just as soon as he attempted, independently, to apply these guides to some doubtful point, he fell back into the same perplexities as before. The terms mind, will, freedom, essence, had a certain meaning to his intellect as long as he followed the clue established by the deductions of these philosophers, and allowed himself to be caught in the snare of their subtle distinctions. But when practical life asserted its point of view, this artistic structure fell, like a house built of cards, and it became evident that the edifice was built only of beautiful words, having no more connection than logic with the serious side of life. Once, as he was reading Schopenhauer, he substituted the term love for that which this philosopher calls will, and this new philosophy consoled him for a few days while he clung to it, but it also proved unsatisfactory when he regarded it from the standpoint of practical life. Then it seemed to be the thin muslin without warmth as a dress. Sergey Ivanovitch advised him to read Khomyakov's theological writings, and though he was at first repelled by the excessive affectation of the author's style, and his strong polemic tendency, he was struck by their teachings regarding the Church. He was struck also by the development of the following thought: Man, when alone, cannot attain the knowledge of theological truths. The true light is kept for a communion of souls who are filled with the same love, that is, for the Church. He was delighted with the thought, how much easier it is to accept the Church, which united with it all believing people and was endowed with holiness and infallibility, since it had God for its head, to accept its teaching as to creation, the fall and redemption, and through it to reach God, than to begin with God, a far-off, mysterious God, the creation and the rest of it. But, as he read, after Khomyakov, a history of the Church by a Catholic writer, and the history of the Church by an Orthodox writer, and perceived that the Orthodox Greek Church and the Roman Catholic Church, both of them in their very essence infallible, were antagonistic, he saw that he had been deluded by Khomyakov's church teachings, and this edifice also fell into dust, like the constructions of philosophy. During this whole spring he was not himself, and passed hours of misery. I cannot live without knowing what I am, and why I exist. Since I cannot reach this knowledge, life is impossible, said Levin to himself. In the infinitude of time, in the infinitude of matter, In the infinitude of space, an organic cell is formed, exists for a moment, and bursts. That cell is I. This was a cruel lie, but it was the soul, the supreme result of the labor of the human mind for centuries. It was the final creed on which were founded the latest researches of the scientific spirit. It was the dominant conviction, and Levin, without knowing exactly why, simply because this theory seemed to him the clearest, was involuntarily held by it. But this conclusion was not merely a lie, it was the cruel jest of some evil spirit, cruel, inimical, to which it was impossible to submit. To get away from it was a duty. Deliverance from it was in the power of everyone, and the one means of deliverance was death. And Levin, the happy father of a family, a man in perfect health, was sometimes so tempted to commit suicide that he hid ropes from sight, lest he should hang himself, and feared to go out with his gun, lest he should shoot himself. But Levin did not hang himself, or shoot himself, but lived and struggled on. When Levin puzzled over what he was and why he was born, he found no answer and fell into despair. But when he ceased to ask himself these questions, he seemed to know what he was and why he was alive, for the very reason that he resolutely and definitely lived and worked. Even during the more recent months he had lived far more strenuously and resolutely than ever before. Toward the end of June he returned to the country and resumed his ordinary work in Pokrovskoye. The superintendence of the estates of his brother and sister, his relations with his neighbors and his muzhiks, his family cares, his new enterprise in bee culture, which he had taken up this year, occupied all his time. These interests occupied him, not because he carried them on with a view to their universal application, as he had done before, but, on the contrary, because being now on the one hand disillusioned by the lack of success in his former undertakings for the common good, on the other being too much engrossed by his own thoughts and the very multitude of affairs calling for his attention, he entirely relinquished all his attempts of cooperative advantage, and he occupied himself with his affairs simply because it seemed to him that he was irresistibly impelled to do what he did, and could not do otherwise. Formerly, almost from childhood till he reached manhood, when he began to do anything that would be good for all, for humanity, for Russia, he saw that the thought of it gave him, in advance, a pleasing sense of joy. But the action in itself never realized his hopes. Nor had he full conviction that the work was necessary, and the activity itself, which seemed at first so important, kept growing smaller and smaller, and came to naught. But now that since his marriage he had become more and more restricted by life for its own sake, though he had no pleasure at the thought of his activity, he felt a conviction that his work was indispensable, and saw that the results gained were far more satisfactory than before. Now, quite against his will, he cut deeper and deeper into the soil, like a plough that cannot choose its path or turn from its furrow. To live as his fathers and grandfathers had lived, to carry out their work so as to hand it on in turn to his children, seemed to him a plain duty. It was as necessary as the duty of eating when hungry, and he knew that, to reach this end, he was under obligation so to conduct the machinery of the estate at Pokrovskoye that there might be profit in it. As indubitably as a debt required to be paid, so it was incumbent on him to preserve his paternal estate in such a condition that his son, receiving it in turn, might say, "Thank you, my father," just as Levin himself was grateful to his ancestors for what they had cleared and tilled. He felt that he had no right to rent his land to the muzhiks, but that he himself must keep everything under his own eye, maintain his cattle, fertilize his fields, set out trees. It was impossible not to look out for the interests of Sergey Ivanovitch and his sister, and all the peasants that came to consult him, as it was to abandon the child that had been given into his hands. He felt obliged to look after the interests of his sister-in-law, who with her children was living at his house, and of his wife with her child, and he had to spend with them at least a small part of his time. And all this, together with his hunting and his new occupation of bee culture, filled to overflowing his life, the meaning of which he could not understand when he reflected on it. Not only did Levin see clearly what it was his duty to do, but he saw how he must fulfill it, and what had paramount importance. He knew that it was requisite to hire laborers as cheaply as possible, but to get them into his power by paying down money in advance and getting them at less than market price, he would not do, although this was very advantageous. It was permissible to sell fodder to the musics in time of scarcity, even though he felt sorry for those who were improvident, but he felt it his duty to do away with inns and drinking places, even though they brought in great profit. On principle, he punished as severely as he could thefts from his wood, but when he found cattle straying he was not inclined to exact a fine, and though it annoyed the guards and brought the punishment into contempt, he always insisted on having the cattle driven out again. He advanced money to Pyotr to save him from the claws of a money-lender, who charged him 10% a month, but he made no allowance for arrears in the obrok, or money due him from negligent muzhiks. He found it impossible to pardon an overseer because a small meadow was not mowed and the grass was wasted, but he would not let them mow a piece of land amounting to 80 desiatins, or 216 acres, on which a young forest had been planted. He would not excuse a muzhik who went home in working hours because his father had died, sorry as he was for him, and he had to pay him lower wages for the costly months of idleness, but he was bound to give board and lodging to old servants who were superannuated. Levin felt that it was right, on returning home, to go first to his wife, who was not well, though some muzhiks had been waiting for 3 hours to see him, and he knew, in spite of all the pleasure that he should have in seeing his bees hived, nevertheless he felt in duty bound to deprive himself of this pleasure, and let his old beeman transfer the swarm without him, and go and talk with the muzhiks who had come to the apiary for him. Whether he did well or ill, he knew not, and he did not try to settle it, but, moreover, he avoided all thoughts and discussions on the subject. Reasoning led him to doubt, and prevented him from seeing what was right to do or not to do. When he ceased to consider, but simply lived, he never failed to find in his soul the presence of an infallible judge, telling him which of 2 possible courses was the best to take, and which was the worst. And when he failed to follow this inner voice, he was instantly made aware of it. Thus he lived, not knowing, and not seeing the possibility of knowing, what he was or why he lived in the world, and tortured by his ignorance to such a degree that he feared committing suicide, and yet resolutely pursuing the course of life traced out for him. The day on which Sergey Ivanovitch reached Pokrovskoye had been unusually full of torment for Levin. It was at that hurried, busy season of the year when all the peasantry are engaged in putting forth an extraordinary effort, and showing an endurance which are quite unknown in the ordinary conditions of their lives, and which would be prized very highly if it were not repeated each year, and did not produce such very simple results. Mowing and sowing rye and oats, reaping, harvesting, threshing, these are labors which seem simple and commonplace, but to accomplish them in the short time accorded by nature, everyone, old and young, must set to work. For 3 or 4 weeks they must be content with the simplest fare, black bread, garlic, and kvass, must sleep only a few hours, and must not pause night or day. And every year this happens throughout all Russia. Having lived the larger part of his life in the country and in the closest relations with the peasantry, Levin always at harvest time felt that this universal activity among the people embraced his own life. In the early morning he had gone to the field of early rye, to the field where they were carrying off the oats in ricks. Then he came back to breakfast with his wife and sister-in-law, and had afterward gone off on foot to the farm, where he was trying a new threshing machine. This whole day, Levin, as he talked with the overseer and the muzhiks in the field, as he talked at the house with his wife and Dolly and the children and his father-in-law, thought of only one thing, and constantly the same questions pursued him. What am I? And where am I? And why am I here? As he stood in the cool shadow of his newly thatched barn, where the hazelwood timbers, still smelling of the fragrant leaves, held down the straw to freshly peeled aspen timbers that made the roof, Levin gazed, now through the open doors, where whirled and played the dry and choking dust thrown off by the threshing machine, now at the hot sunlight lying on the grass of the threshing floor, and at the fresh straw just brought out of the barn, and now at the white-breasted swallows with their spotted heads as they flew about twittering and settling under the eaves, or, shaking their wings, darted through the open doors. And then again at the peasantry bustling about in the dark and dusty barn, and strange ideas came into his mind. Why is all this done? He asked himself. Why am I standing here? Why am I compelling them to work? And why are they working so hard? Why are they doing their best in my presence? Why is my old friend, Matryona, putting in so with all her might? I cured her when a beam fell on her at the fire, he said to himself as he looked at a hideous old baba who was walking with bare, sunburned feet across the hard, uneven soil, and was plying the rake vigorously. She got well then. But if not today or tomorrow, then in 10 years she must be borne to her grave, and there will be nothing left of her, nor of that pretty girl in red who is husking corn with such graceful, swift motions. They will bury her, and that dappled gelding will soon die, he thought, as he looked at the horse, breathing painfully with distended nostrils and heavily sagging belly, as it struggled up the ever-descending treadmill. They will carry him off, and Fyodor, the machine tender, with his curling beard full of chaff, and his white shoulder showing through a tear in his shirt. They will carry him off too. But now he gathers up the sheaves and gives his commands, and shouts to the women, and, with quick motions, arranges the belt on the machine. And it will be the same with me. They will carry me away, and nothing of me will be left. Why? And, in the midst of his meditations, he mechanically took out his watch to calculate how much they threshed in an hour. It was his duty to do this so that he could pay the men fairly for their day's work. So far, only 3 ricks, he said to himself, and he went to the machine tender and, trying to make his voice heard above the racket, told him to work faster. You've put in too much at once, Fyodor. You see it stops, so it wastes time. Do it more regularly. Fyodor, his face black with dust and sweat, shouted back some unintelligible reply, but entirely failed to carry out Levin's directions. He mounted the drum and took Fyodor's place and began to do the feeding. He worked thus till it was the muzhik's dinner hour, not a very long time, and then, in company with Fyodor, he left the barn and talked with him, leaning against a beautifully stacked pile of yellow rye saved for planting. Fyodor was from a distant village, the very one where Levin had formerly let the association have some land. Now it was rented to a dvornik. Levin talked with Fyodor about this land, and asked him if it were not possible that Platon, a rich and trustworthy muzhik of his village, would take it for the next year. Price too high. Won't catch Platon, Konstantin Dmitrich, replied the muzhik, wiping the chaff off from his sweaty chest. Yes, but how does Kirillov make money out of it? Mittuich. By this contemptuous diminutive, Fyodor called the dvornik. What doesn't he make money out of? He puts on the screws and gets the last drop. He has no pity on the peasants. But Uncle Fokanuich, so he called the old man Platon, does he try to fleece a man? And he gives credit when anyone owes him. He does not try to squeeze it out of them. He's that kind of a man. Yes, but why does he give them credit? Well, of course men differ. One lives for his belly, like Mittuich. But Fokanuich, he's an honest man. He lives for his soul. He remembers God. How does he remember God and live for his soul? Exclaimed Levin eagerly. Why, that's plain enough. It's to live according to God, according to the truth. People differ. Take you, Konstantin Dmitrich, for example. You couldn't wrong a man. Yes. Prashai, goodbye, exclaimed Levin, deeply moved, and taking his cane, he turned toward the house. As he recalled the muzhik's words, how Fokanuich lived for his soul according to God, according to truth, confused but weighty thoughts arose within him from some hidden source, and filled his soul with their brilliant light. Levin, with long steps, strode along the highway, filled not so much with his thoughts, he could not as yet get rid of them, as with a spiritual impulse, such as he had never known before. The peasant's words had had in his soul the effect of an electric spark, suddenly condensing the cloud of dim, incoherent thoughts which had not ceased to fill his mind, even while he was talking about the letting of his field. He felt that some new impulse, inexplicable as yet, filled his heart with joy. Not to live for oneself, but for God. What God? Could he have said anything more meaningless than what he said? He said that we must live, not for ourselves, that is, for what interests and pleases us, but for something incomprehensible, for God, whom no one knows or can define. Still, call it nonsense. Did I understand Fyodor? Didn't I also feel convinced of its truth? Did I find it either false or absurd? Nay, I understood it, and find in it the same meaning as he finds, and understood it more completely and clearly than anything else in life. And not alone I, but all the world, perfectly understand this, and have no doubt of it, and are unanimous in its favor. And I was seeking for miracles, and regretting that I could not see one which might fill me with amazement. A material miracle would have seduced me, but the real miracle, the only one possibly existing, surrounds me on all sides, and I have not remarked it. Fyodor says Kirillov, the dvornik, lives for his belly. I know what he means by that. No rational being, none of us, can live in any other way. But Fyodor says, too, that it is wrong to live for the belly, but that we should live for the truth, for God. And I know what that means as well. I, and millions of men, mujiks and sages who have thought and written on the subject, or in their obscure language have talked about it, in the past and in the present, we are in accord on one point, and that is, that we should live for the good. The only knowledge that I and all men possess that is clear, indubitable, absolute, is here. We have not reached it by reason. Reason excludes it, for it has neither cause nor effect. The good, if it had a cause, would cease to be the good. If it had an effect, a reward, it would cease to be the good. The good must be outside of the chain of cause and effect. And I know this, and we all know it. Can there be greater miracle than this? Have I really found the solution of my doubts? Shall I cease to suffer? Levin asked himself as he followed the dusty road, insensible to weariness and heat, and feeling that his long travail was at an end. The sensation was so delightful that he could not believe that it was true. He choked with emotion. His strength failed him, and he left the high road and went into the woods, and sat down under the shadow of an aspen on the unmown grass. He uncovered his moist forehead, and stretched himself out on the succulent wood grass, and leaned his head on his hand. Yes, I must reflect and consider, he thought, looking attentively at the untrodden grass in front of him, and watching the movements of an earth beetle crawling up the stalk of couch grass and stopped by a leaf. What discovery have I made? He said to himself, removing the leaf from the beetle's way, and bending down another stalk of couch grass to help the beetle on. What made me so happy? What discovery have I made? I have made no discovery. I have only opened my eyes to what I already know. I have learned to recognize that power which formerly gave me life, and gives me life again today. I have freed myself from error. I have come to know my master. I used to say there was going on in my body, in the body of this grass, in the body of this beetle. The beetle did not want to go to the other stalk, but spread its wings and flew away. Incessant change of matter, in conformity to certain physical, chemical, and physiological laws. And in all of us, together with the aspens and the clouds, and the nebulae, there was evolution. Evolution from what? Into what? Endless evolution and conflict. But was conflict with the infinite possible? And I was surprised to find nothing along this line, in spite of my best efforts, which could reveal to me the meaning of my life, my motives, my longings. But the consciousness that there is a meaning is, nevertheless, so strong and clear that it forms the very foundation of my existence. And I marveled and rejoiced when the music said, "To live for God, for the soul." Now I can say that I know the meaning of life. It is to live for God, for my own soul. And this meaning, in spite of its clearness, is mysterious and miraculous. And such is the meaning of all existence. Yes, there is pride, said he to himself, turning over on his stomach and beginning to tie into a knot the stalks of grass while trying not to break them. Not only pride of intellect, but the stupidity of intellect. Yes, it is the wickedness of intellect, he repeated. He succinctly went over in memory the course of his thought for the last 2 years, from the day when the idea of death struck him on seeing his beloved brother hopelessly sick. Then he had clearly resolved that, since man had no other prospect than suffering, death, and eternal oblivion, he must either commit suicide or find the explanation of the problem of existence, and in such manner as to see in it something more than the cruel irony of a malevolent spirit. But he had not done either, but continued to live, to think, and to feel. He had married, and had experienced new joys, which made him happy when he did not ponder on the meaning of life. What did this mean? It meant that he was thinking badly and living well. Without knowing it, he had been sustained by those spiritual verities which he had sucked in with his mother's milk, and he indulged in thought, not only now not recognizing those truths, but even strenuously avoiding them. Now it was clear to him that he could live only through the blessed influence of the faith in which he had been taught. What should I have been? How should I have lived, if I had not absorbed these beliefs, if I had not known that I must live for God, and not for the satisfaction of my desires? I should have been a thief, a liar, a murderer. Nothing of what seems the chief joy of my life would have had any existence for me. And, though he made the most strenuous efforts of his imagination, he could not picture to himself what kind of a wild creature he might have been if he had not really known the aim of his existence. I was in search of an answer to my question, thought I could not give it, for the problem was too lofty. Life itself, with the innate knowledge of good and evil, alone could give me an answer. And this knowledge I did not acquire. It was given me, like all the rest. Given. I could not know where to get it. Did I get it from reason? But would reason ever have proved to me that I ought to love my neighbor instead of choking him? I was taught it in my childhood, but I believed it gladly because it was already existent in my soul. Reason discovered the struggle for existence, that law which demands the overthrow of every obstacle in the way of our desires. That is the result of reason. But reason has nothing to do with loving our neighbor. Levin remembered a recent scene between Dolly and her children. The children had been left alone, and had amused themselves by making raspberry jam over a candle, and throwing milk into each other's faces. Their mother, catching them in the act, scolded them in their uncle's presence, and sought to make them understand how much work was involved in what they were destroying, that the labor was performed for their benefit, that, if they broke the cups, they couldn't have anything to drink from, and if they wasted the milk, they wouldn't have any more, and would starve to death. Levin was struck by the indifference and skepticism with which the children heard their mother's words. They were only sorry to have their interesting sport interrupted, and they did not believe a word of what she said. They did not believe because they did not know the value of what they were playing with, and did not understand that they were destroying their own means of subsistence. That is all very well, they thought, but there is nothing interesting or worthwhile in it, because it is always the same and always will be, and it is monotonous. We don't have to think about it. It is done for us. But we would like to do something new and original. And here we are making jam in a cup over the candle, and squirting the milk in each other's faces. It's fun. It's new, and not half so stupid as to drink milk out of a cup. Is it not thus that we act? Is it not the way I have acted, in trying to penetrate by reasoning the subjects of nature and the problem of human life? Is it not the same that all the philosophers have done with their theories which lead, by a course of reasoning strange and unnatural to man, to the knowledge of what he long has known, and known so surely that without it he could not live? Do we not see clearly, in the development of the theory of each, that the real meaning of human existence is as indubitably known as it is known to Fyodor, the muzhik? And do they see any more clearly than he does the principal meaning of life? Do they not all come back to this, even though it may be by a route which is often equivocal? If we were to leave the children to get their own living, make their own utensils, do the milking instead of playing pranks, they would die of hunger. There now, give us over to our own ideas and passions, with no knowledge of our Creator, without the consciousness of moral good and evil, and what would be the result? We reason because we are spiritually satiated. We are children. Whence comes this joyous knowledge, which I share with the muzhik, and which alone gives me serenity of spirit? Where did I get it? Here am I, a Christian, brought up in the faith, surrounded by the blessings of Christianity, living upon these spiritual blessings without being conscious of them, and like children I have been reasoning, or at least trying to reason, out the meaning of life. But in the serious moments of life, in the hour of suffering, just as when children are cold and hungry, I turn to Him, and, like these same children whom their mother reprimands for their childish faults, I feel that my childish efforts to get out of the mad circle of reasoning have done me no good. Yes, reason has taught me nothing. What I know has been given, revealed to me through the heart, and especially through faith in the teachings of the Church. The Church. The Church? Repeated Levin, turning over again, and, as he rested his head on his hand, looking at a herd of cattle down by the river at a distance. Can I really believe all that the Church teaches? Said he, to test himself and to bring up everything that might destroy his present feeling of security. He expressly called to mind the Church teachings which more than all had seemed strange to him and disgusted him. Creation? Yes. But how did I myself explain existence? Existence, the devil, sin. How did I explain evil? Redemption. But I know nothing, and can know nothing except what is told me and everyone else. And now it seemed to him that not one of these church dogmas was inimical to the great objects of life, faith in God, in goodness. On the contrary, all tended to produce that greatest of all miracles, that which consists in enabling the whole world, with its millions of human beings, young and old, the muzhik and Lvov, and Kitty and peasants and Tsars, married and single, to comprehend the same great truths, so as to live that life of the soul which alone is worth living, and which is our only aim. Lying on his back, he looked up into the high, cloudless sky. Do I not know, thought he, that that is infinity of space, and not a vault of blue stretching above me? But, however I strain my sight, I can see only a vaulted dome. And, in spite of my knowledge of infinite space, I have more satisfaction in looking at it as a blue vaulted dome than when I try to look beyond. Levin stopped thinking. He listened to the mysterious voices which seemed to wake joyfully in him. Is it really faith? He sought, fearing to believe in his happiness. My God, I thank Thee, he cried, and he swallowed down the sobs that arose, and brushed away with both hands the tears that filled his eyes. Levin looked away and saw the herd, and his one-horse telega and his coachman, who approached the herd of cattle, and began talking to the herdsman. Then he heard the sound of wheels and the neighing of the horse, but he was so occupied with his thoughts that he did not think why it was that his coachman was coming for him. He only realized it when the coachman, while still some distance off, cried, "The mistress sent for you. Your brother and another baron have come." Levin got in at once and took the reins. As if awakened from sleep, it was long before he could collect his thoughts. He looked at the well-fed horse, and at the spot on his neck where the harness rubbed, and he looked at Ivan, the coachman, sitting beside him, and he thought of how he had been expecting his brother, and that his wife was probably troubled because he was gone so long, and he tried to guess who the unknown guest who had come with his brother might be. And his brother and his wife and the unknown guest now seemed to him different from what they had been before. He felt that henceforth all his relations with these friends would be more pleasant than they had been. "Now there will be no more of that coldness, such as there used to be, between my brother and me. No more disputes. Nor will Kitty and I quarrel any more. And whoever my guest is, I shall be polite to him, and kind to the servants, and to Ivan. All will be different." And holding in his good horse, which was whinnying with impatience and pleading for permission to show his paces, Levin kept looking at Ivan, who was sitting next to him, not knowing what to do with his idle hands, and constantly pulling down his shirt, which the wind tugged at, and in his attempt to find a pretext for beginning a conversation with the man, he thought of saying that the horse's girth was buckled up too tightly, but then this seemed like censuring him, and he wanted to say something pleasant. "You had better turn to the right and avoid that stump," said the coachman, taking hold of one of the reins. "Please not touch, or try to give me lessons," said Levin, exasperated by his coachman's interference. Just the same as always, he was made angry by any interference with his affairs, and he immediately became conscious how mistaken he was in supposing for a moment that his new spiritual condition could keep its character unchanged on contact with the reality. When they arrived within a quarter of a verst of the house, Levin saw Grisha and Tanya running to meet him. "Uncle Kostya, Mama is coming, and Grandpa, and Sergey Ivanovitch, and someone else," they cried as they ran up to the cart. "Tell me, who is it?" "Oh, he's an awful, horrid man, who does so with his arms," said Tanya, climbing up into the cart and mimicking Katavasov. "Tell me, is he young or old?" asked Levin, laughing, reminded of someone by Tanya's performance. "Ah, I only hope he is not a bore," said Levin to himself. As soon as they reached a turn in the road and saw the party approaching, Levin recognized Katavasov, who was in a straw hat, and gesticulating exactly as Tanya had represented it. Katavasov was very fond of talking philosophy, and his conceptions were wholly drawn from the natural sciences, which had always been his specialty, and in Moscow Levin had frequently had discussions with him. And one of these discussions, in which Katavasov had evidently felt that he was victorious, occurred to Levin's mind as soon as he saw him. "Henceforth," he said to himself, "I will not enter into discussions, or express myself so flippantly." Leaping from the cart and joining Katavasov and his brother, he asked where Kitty was. "She has taken Mitya to Kolok." Kolok was a piece of woodland near the house. "She wanted to get him established there. It was so hot at the house," said Dolly. Levin always advised his wife against taking the baby into the woods, because he felt it was dangerous, so this news was not pleasant to him. "She carries that son of hers from one place to another," said the old prince. "I told her she'd better try the ice house." "She wanted to go to the beehives. She thought you were there," added Dolly. "That is where we were going." "Well, what have you been doing that's good?" said Sergey Ivanovitch, dropping behind the others and walking with his brother. "Oh, nothing particular. As usual, busy with the farming. You'll stay with us a while now. We've been expecting you a long time." "Only a fortnight. I have a great deal to do at Moscow." At these words the two brothers looked at one another, and Levin, in spite of his usual and now especially strong desire to have friendly, and above all simple, relations with his brother, felt that it was awkward for him to look at him. He dropped his eyes and was at a loss what to say. Trying to select some topic of conversation which would be agreeable to Sergey Ivanovitch, and avoiding the Serbian war and the Slavonic question, A hint at which Sergey Ivanovitch's remark about his occupation in Moscow gave, Levin began to talk about his brother's book. "Well," he asked, "have there been many reviews of your book?" Sergey Ivanovitch smiled at the intention of the question. "No one thinks anything about it. I least of all," he said. "You see, Darya Alexandrovna, we're going to have a shower," he added, pointing with his umbrella to the white clouds which were piling up above the aspen tops. It was evident by these words that the relationship between the brothers, which Levin wanted to overcome, was just the same as of old. If not unfriendly, at least cool. Levin approached Katavasov. "How good it was of you to come to us," said he. "I've wanted to come for a long time. Now we shall have time to talk. Have you read Spencer?" "Not thoroughly. I don't get anything out of him." "How so? That is interesting. Why is that?" "I've definitely made up my mind that the answers to certain questions which interest me are not to be found in him or his followers. Now—" But he was suddenly struck by the pleasant and serene expression of Katavasov's face, and he felt so sorry at having evidently disturbed his mental equilibrium by his remark that, suddenly remembering his resolution, he stopped short. "However, we will talk about that by and by," he added. "If we are going to the apiary, let us go this way, by this path," he said, turning to the others. Passing through a narrow path along by an unmown field, covered on one side with an abundance of those bright flowers called Ivan da Maria, and in the midst of which grew frequent patches of the tall dark green hellebore, Levin led his guests, who were afraid of being stung, to the cool dense shade of some young aspens, and established them on some benches and logs especially prepared for the purpose of receiving the beehives, and he himself went to the storehouse to fetch for the children, and the grown people as may, some bread, cucumbers, and fresh honey. Trying to make as little disturbance as possible, and listening to the bees, which came flying more and more thickly around him, he strode along the path that led to the izba. At the very door, a bee entangled in his beard and began to buzz, but he carefully freed himself from it. Going into the cool entry, he took his wire mask down from the peg where it hung and put it on, and thrusting his hands into his pockets, he went into the enclosure of the apiary, where, amid a smoothly shaven lawn, stood in straight rows on linden stakes all the old hives, each having for him its own special history, while the newer ones which had been set up that year were ranged along the wall. At the entrance of the hives he could see the young bees and the drones clustering together and tumbling over one another, while in their midst the working bees were industriously darting off in a straight line toward the forest where the linden trees were in bloom, and quickly returning laden with their pollen. His ears were filled with the incessant monotonous humming made by the workers as they flew in with their burdens, by the drones enjoying their holiday, and by the guardian bees giving warning of the approach of an enemy and ready to sting. On one side of the enclosure the old beekeeper was smoothing a hoop and did not see Levin, and Levin, without speaking to him, stood in the midst of his apiary. He was glad of the chance of being alone, so as to collect himself in face of the reality which had so suddenly come into vivid contrast with his recent state of mind. He remembered that he had already been angry with Ivan and shown coldness to his brother, and had spoken foolishly with Katavasov. "Can it be possible that my happiness was only a transitory feeling, which will pass away and leave no trace behind?" But at the same moment as he analyzed his state of mind, he felt with joy that his experience had left new and important results. Practical life had only temporarily disturbed the spiritual calm which he had found, but in his heart it was still intact. Just as the bees, buzzing around him, threatened him, and robbed him of his physical calm, and compelled him to defend himself, so did the cares which surrounded him, as he sat in his little cart, disturb his spiritual calm, but this lasted only while he was in their midst. Just as his physical strength was intact while he was defending himself against the bees, so his newly attained spiritual power was also unimpaired.